Hello! This is Fiona Apollo, and I'm hoping you're all having as wonderful a day as I am. Actually, I hope your day is a lot more wonderful than mine because I'm an idiot who fell down the stairs this morning just before writing this, but never mind that. Today, I want to talk about gender swapping. So, I've been punishing myself again by staying on Twitter, and I've been reading a lot of people's thoughts in regards to identity and fiction and all of that because, well, simply put, it's interesting. The way that people deconstruct the bigger picture in order to better define themselves is really fascinating to me, and I really don't think it hurts anyone to explore themselves in this manner. But then, of course, things started popping off about the way that people are interacting with trans people in particular lately. They're being given a really hard time, and it really hasn't been pleasant to read about. A sprinkling of JK roundabout made its way into the discussion because, of course, she did. But ultimately, the one thing that caught my interest was a couple of hot takes about gender swapping characters. And this interested me because gender swap AUs were a big thing when I was a teen on the internet, and I remember it quite fondly. But there seems to be a more critical discussion of it that's begun to creep up in the conversation, and with how many people have felt more safe and more able to discuss topics around gender expression, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm all for it, to be honest. Question everything, that's how you learn. But you know, at the same time, how much is too much, and does it truly reflect what most people think about it? Let's find out! Today we're going to look into what gender swapping entails, how people view it, particularly in relation to fiction, what are some issues with it, and the ways we can approach it depending on the circumstance. Oh, and I also asked a couple of commentary peeps if I could do swaps of their characters, so look forward to that. I find this topic really intriguing as someone who uses their characters to explore different identities. And whether you realise it or not, when you make the conscious decision to create a character who would have a very different lived experience to you in real life, you also happen to be doing this in some capacity. There are also people who do this stuff to be more in touch with their own sense of self, but this doesn't always have to be the case, bear in mind. Some people do it to learn more about how other people live as well. This can include characters of different races, sexualities, upbringings, physical disabilities, and so on, but we are just going to focus on gender for the most part in this video. Please note that, as always, a lot of what I talk about in my videos is purely speculative and based on my own opinions and perspectives unless stated otherwise. If you have any additional thoughts or issues relating to anything I say here, please leave a comment below, and of course, if you like my stuff, please consider liking and subscribing. It would make me very, very happy. Alright, let's begin! Part 1. What is gender swapping? So, what is gender swapping? Gender swapping, or gender bending as it's also referred to as, I'm going to stick with gender swapping for the sake of ease, is basically what it says on the tin. You swap the gender of an existing character, whether it be to explore different aesthetics, plot differences in the source material, add depth to a character that some people might perceive as good representation for certain groups. There's a lot of reasons people do it. When I was a teenager and neck deep in the Hetalia fandom, I was 14 and it was 2010, I don't want to hear about how problematic that anime was because we all know that now, okay? We've all grown up. But yeah, there was an alternate canon version of a lot of the characters that was called Neo-Talia, and it was really cool to see popular existing characters reimagined as the opposite sex. Even outside of canon, you can find gender swaps of practically any fictional character that you can think of. Lara Croft? Yeah. Goku? Why not? Bowser? You know, some things are probably better left alone. Fundamentally, it is interesting to so many people to see how certain characters would look and behave when they are the opposite gender, but there are also some other aspects that come into play with this too. In storytelling, one prominent example is the act of gender swapping existing characters in media as a way to drive a narrative in standalone episodes, and it's often used as a way to turn this circumstance into some kind of lesson, usually for the boy characters. There are many instances of this, most notably in cartoons from the 2000s and 2010s like Johnny Bravo, Adventure Time, and Fairy Oddparents. For example, anyone who isn't familiar with the cartoon Johnny Bravo, Johnny was this uber-macho young man who lived with his mother, who was a parody of the teddy boy stereotype from the 1950s, who cared a lot about the hypermasculine image. One episode had Johnny be cursed by a psychic lady to live life as a woman until he understood why they always rejected his advances towards them. It taught many young boys watching the cartoon at the time that girls do not like being approached in the way that both Johnny and other men in the episode were going about it, and also taught them that women can be strong and independent people by forcing Johnny to literally walk in their shoes. It sent a good message using an unconventional narrative, and it worked really well. However, this could also be used in a negative way as well, such as in Fairy Oddparents, where it was still kind of used as a way to teach the main character a lesson, but was also used as this kind of karmic punishment. In one episode, Wanda used Timmy's wording against him and transformed him into a girl, and in retaliation, Cosmo and Wanda were also gender swapped and more or less became the quintessential male and female stereotypes. So even if there was some kind of lesson, it still painted becoming the opposite sex as some kind of punishment. And considering Butch Hartman's views on things like gender and sexuality, specifically in relation to trans identities, seeing this kind of thing in his shows really isn't all that surprising, which is honestly wild, considering how transcoded the main characters in his cartoons ended up being. Alternatively, when looking at the realm of fan content, gender swaps can often be used by fans to explore the ways in which a society functions in a fictional world, particularly when it comes to fantasy, as well as the ways in which gender swapped characters would react to it. For example, what would the implications be if the Gerudo people from The Legend of Zelda were made to be matriarchal instead of patriarchal? Would the boys born into this species be made to be outcasted or enslaved instead of becoming king? What if a trans Gerudo was to become ruler? What would happen then? What if Urbosa was to be born a boy in this kind of society? Would she have been respected as a guardian by her own people? These are the kinds of situations that could be potentially explored using this trope. Gender swapping existing characters in fan works can also be used by fans as a kind of self-insert without actually creating a self-insert. Very often I used to see gender swap characters beating down on another character, usually an antagonist or someone who has unpopular views or just generally isn't liked, while being backed up or applauded by the original counterpart or the people in that media. And I feel like quite often when this was done, it was sometimes used as a form of projection, as most fandom spaces tended to be populated by young girls. A lot of protagonists in media have historically been men, so when a young girl decides she likes a piece of media so much that she wants to create a gender swap of the protag who behaves more like a self-insert, is it really that big of a deal? Sure, it might be cringy, but young girls get ripped to shreds for having any kind of interest in practically anything, so in my opinion, leave them be, they're not hurting anyone. Another way for people to use these characters to explore themselves is through gender identity and sexuality. It's very common for members of the LGBTQ+ community to use characters to explore their own sense of attraction to certain groups, or to figure out their own sense of self-identification. And personally, I think this is one of the safest ways to do so. You're meeting fellow peers who share the same interests and struggles who you can talk to, and you may even be helping onlookers to do their own bit of self-reflection on the subject without outing yourself and putting yourself in a dangerous position. And I think this is also important to state, but you don't have to think you are or be a part of a certain group to explore different types of identities in fiction for your own curiosity. For anyone new to my channel, the talk sprite character I'm using right now is actually the protagonist of a story I'm developing on the side called Mint and Friends, and Mint as a character is in fact gender fluid. Do I think I'm gender fluid myself? I have no clue. I just think exploring different types of characters is fun. The main reason I went with this decision is because I gender swapped them and liked the design, so I decided there was no harm in making it canon so long as I did my research. You don't have to be the same gender or sexuality as a character in order to depict them in your own works. And they are a very good way of exploring concepts that you otherwise aren't sure of how to approach or to look into. And this can be the same for characters that you definitely can't identify as anyway, such as POC or disabled characters. Just as an FYI, there are definitely things that you can get wrong when doing this, and sometimes it's going to be inevitable, so a way to avoid potentially falling victim to things like negative stereotyping is to just be aware of how people in the specific communities you are pulling inspiration from present themselves and pay attention to the characters they create to represent themselves too. It's encouraged to step out of your comfort zone and diversify your creations, but just be sure to be mindful and receptive to feedback when necessary. So those are some examples and instances of gender swapping and why it might be done, but what are some of the issues? What problems could arise from this trope? Let's take a look. Part 2. What are the issues? So, a few of the issues I'm going to go over first are in regards to when a male character gets swapped to female, but we are also going to discuss non-conforming and trans characters as well a bit further in. Most commonly with male to female gender swaps, holy Mary do they get sexualized to hell and back, even when the original design isn't that way inclined. Even in cartoons, the difference between a male and female version of a character can be very telling of how the designers view people of a certain gender. As I mentioned in my Amphibia video, some parts of the art world are unfortunately teeming, and I mean teeming, with perverts. This also happens with male characters too, but it's not quite to the same extent. I think sometimes this can seem like the opposite is the case, as there is quite a big audience for male gender swaps in popular online spaces, and a lot of the time these depictions really do gear towards objectification and all of that, but that's because the stuff you see on Twitter and Tumblr and places like that isn't quite as hardcore as how a lot of the female gender swaps are depicted. It might be suggestive, sure, but it doesn't quite carry the same weight, so to speak. Something that also happens a lot with male to female gender swaps following this is the sudden reinforcement of beauty standards, even when the original male design wasn't considered all that attractive. And this is super apparent when ugly 2 out of 10 male characters are being turned into like Victoria's Secret models, and it becomes very clear that the design was made for a specific purpose in mind. It just really gets me every single time, like, you know girls can be ugly too, right? But personally, I think in addition to beauty standards being enforced, the unfortunate hypersexualization of female fictional characters also kind of plays into this problem. I think what also doesn't help is that people are a lot more forgiving towards men who aren't as fixated on keeping up their appearances as they are towards girls. I remember seeing this image years ago making the rounds of a gender-swapped Roadhog from Overwatch, and just, there's a certain balance when it comes to making a character look different enough for the design to be interesting but still recognizable, and this is just the perfect example, in my opinion, of how these issues can kind of end up culminating. Of course, it's the artist's choice to depict the characters in this way. I'm not going to say you can't do this stuff because that's not up to me, and at the end of the day it is just a drawing, but the choice to do this is very clearly rooted in some obvious biases. There isn't really any reason for a character called Roadhog, who in the canon is this conventionally unattractive character, to be this petite bombshell in my opinion. This can also be the case for male characters. We all love a good himbo, but it can be considered to be doing the same thing in this specific context. But as I said, there doesn't seem to be as big of a sense of uneasiness towards these depictions because, well, how do I put this? There's still that sense of respect for the male character rather than just seeing them as an object. It's a very male gaze versus female gaze kind of deal. This isn't always a negative, however, and when you're gender swapping characters and giving them different body types, it can be good to explore them instead of staying in your comfort zone, especially if it might fit in with some of the character's personality traits. A male character who is obsessed with his looks and has the physique of a bodybuilder, for example, wouldn't seem out of place looking like a woman who is conventionally beautiful, and vice versa. And sometimes, like the whole himbo thing, I know I'm talking about this in a pretty straight-laced manner, but this is just a thing that people do for fun, so don't feel like you're actually doing something terrible if you do swap a character's gender to make them attractive or sexy or whatever. It's not actually that deep, but it's never a bad thing to look at what you're making and consuming, just to do a bit of introspection here and there, just to broaden your own horizons. Moving on from the more rigid discussion that pertains to just male and female, let's chat about the implications this has when you throw trans and non-binary characters into the mix. So with non-binary characters especially, doing gender swaps can be considered kind of a dismissal of that character's identity because of the strong associations with male and female as we have just gone over, and non-binary as an identity is usually intended in fiction as a rejection of these strict gender norms. I think something that worries people is that non-binary is starting to become viewed as this like new third gender that is between male and female when it really isn't. It's a lot more complicated than that. Something that also adds to this is that non-binary characters are still an extremely small percentage of characters in media. We're literally talking like less than 1%. With that said, what's the deal when it's the opposite and male or female characters are made to be non-binary? Well, at that point, can it really be considered a gender swap? Personally, I don't know if it can, because you're not really swapping the gender, so to speak. It's more like you're removing it entirely, or at the least are deconstructing it. Personally, at this point, it can become a bit of a blurred line as to whether it can be considered a full-on gender swap or a headcanon, so it's hard to truly say on this. With trans characters, the issue again becomes a little tricky since trans identities, especially those who choose to transition from one end of the binary to another, don't really want to be reminded of who they were in the past, and I think sometimes this can manifest as a kind of discomfort when they see it being done to trans characters in media. On the flip side, some trans people often use gender swaps as a way to explore the concept of transitioning before going through with it themselves, often using specific characters as vessels to explore their curiosities and insecurities surrounding the topic, as well as to vent about things that may bother them, such as dysphoria. While this can be good and healthy as a way to expel a lot of those feelings if they don't feel safe or able to talk about them openly, this can also result in the development of a really strong attachment to certain characters. This doesn't only happen with trans people, mind you, but I definitely remember some time ago that people would try to dictate how others could depict certain characters when it came to giving them specific identities, and it was a whole thing and it got very messy. And again, this was just a very small percentage of people. But yeah, some people were going as far as to say that depicting characters as having specific identities was transphobic. I think in some ways, such as turning a trans character cisgender, I can see the reasoning, but we also need to remember that headcanons themselves are not concrete. Only the people in charge of creating the original media can really call those kinds of shots, and even then, that's kind of what fan content is for. We can change things to our liking. I'm not saying to be dismissive towards anyone's thoughts or feedback, by the way, and I'm definitely not saying to turn trans characters cis, it's just food for thought. Another unfortunate issue with trans characters is fetishization. A really sad and frustrating thing about a lot of LGBTQ+ identities is that up until a few years ago, the most abundant representation we had was found in explicit material, and this tends to be why we get targeted more when it comes to these types of things being drawn of us, and some worry that gender swaps tend to aggravate this problem for certain communities. I think that unfortunately this has gone on for so long now and is so prominent that we won't be able to truly shake it off. The best we can do is focus our attention on what we and the people around us are making, and as always, if something is truly making you uncomfortable, report the content, block the creator, and just keep things moving. That's all we can really do, to be honest. So with all of that said, I've obviously spoken a lot about what I think of all of this, but what about other people? What do they think? Part 3. What do people think? So what do people actually think? Prior to this video being scripted, I put out a post asking what people's opinions on gender swaps were in relation to the concern regarding transphobia. I specifically said, I'm curious, what do we think of gender-bending characters? I've seen that it can be viewed as transphobic and very based on looks, but also that it can help people explore the concept of transitioning in a way. What are people's thoughts? I ended up getting a good chunk of responses, so let's read a few out. Green Machine said, I think it's fine, but when gender-bending a trans character, you should be careful. For example, if you're gender-bending a trans man, make sure you gender-bend them to be a trans woman so that the character isn't cis. Void Rain said, if I'm being honest, it feels like something a lot of queer artists did that people in later years have latched on to being wrong and offensive. As someone who was queer growing up with limited access to different kinds of gender expression, it was eye-opening. Yes, there are bad apples, i.e. female gender bends being explicitly more sexualized and transgender bends being made cisgender, but art is all about experimentation and gender bending characters falls under that umbrella. It's definitely more of a case-by-case thing, but honestly, as a trans person, it's too much of a case thing to police. I personally am for it, despite the bad apples. Kyle Lowe said, I think it's neat. I've seen some cool redesigns and stuff, and if someone is actually helped with it, then that's fair. Just don't redesign people's OCs without permission. That's where it gets kind of weird and moves into fixing art territory, which isn't great. I think the only part where it feels off is when they try to really sexy up male to female fan art, and it's like, you don't have to go that far. That just feels a bit weird, right? Like, for example, this looks good, but it's also a bit much. Peter Town said, I think saying gender bending is transphobic is a bad idea, because it has nothing to do with a trans person except superficially. Like, it's just a costume, really. And imagine not drawing it because of that. That just makes trans people an obstacle/burden, which doesn't seem ideal. Mally Malware said, I'm all for it personally. I don't see it as any different to reimagining characters that are canonically straight as queer, or white characters as POC, or a good character as evil, so on and so forth. For me, it falls into the same vein as any fanfiction or AU exploration of characters. As a more serious perspective, gender bends can also be a means of exploring heteronormative expectations. Not always, of course, but a lot of stories about swapping gender, there's at least some criticism of gender roles in conservative society, which I think is a good thing. Additionally, in stories where the ability to change gender is treated as commonplace, I think that's actually a great thing for trans representation, to display their transition as completely normal, but that's just my opinion on it, and everyone has different worldviews. Sulfuric Acid, great name by the way, said, I've always seen it as a form of AU, so that's the only way I interpret it. I can understand where the other side is coming from, but I think it's a non-issue if you think of the gender bend character as a separate character who functions identically to the original. Danny said, I think it's really fun. I would say that gender bending characters allowed me to explore aspects of gender and sexuality that were very intimidating when I was younger. And Stagbones said, I think it's important to consider trans people when gender bending. If a character is MTF when gender bending, it's important to keep them trans, so FTM if gender bending them. Otherwise it reads as transphobia. Other than that, I think it's fine, just don't make it fetishy. There were a couple more in the thread which I will leave a link to in the description, but I mostly stuck with the more in-depth ones in this instance. The word count is already running away with me a bit. Overall, people are pretty content with gender swapping characters, and many saw it either as their first exposure to non-cis identities or used it as a way to explore their own. It seems to be agreed on that for the most part, it is a case-by-case basis. Most of the issues with it tend to come from what we mentioned earlier about hypersexualization when it comes to male to female gender swaps, and also that gender swapping trans characters in particular particular is a bit of a grey area, but more often than not tended to rub people the wrong way if trans characters were made to be cisgender instead. These are all extremely valid points, and I'm super grateful to everyone who shared their perspectives on the topic. With that said, all I have to add in relation to this to wrap things up is to not worry about it too much aside from just being mindful about what characters you swap and how. These kinds of things are meant to be a fun exploration into a character you like, and is a good way to let your creativity come out in different ways such as character design, story writing, and so on. As well as this, for those who find themselves becoming deeply connected to certain characters, even though some of these characters might mean a lot to you, they are still fictional at the end of the day, and you always have the option to scroll on by or block a person who creates something you really don't want to see. Of course, there will always be some concerns that people should be aware of, but so long as we are willing to listen and learn, I'm sure that these issues won't become a huge problem. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. And also thank you to Manga Kamen, Mali Malware, Hopeless Peaches, and Duchess Celestia for letting me do some gender swaps of their characters. Links to all of their channels will be in the description. Please let me know what you think of them, and if you have any thoughts relating to what we talked about today. Stay safe everyone, don't be an idiot like me, and please watch your footing on the stairs. I think I'm gonna make a cocktail or something, pretend it's like for the queen or whatever. Not really. Bye!